Thank you for coming along to hear me today. I'm Sam Rhynas. I'm COO of Effini, who's a data solutions company. We're based in Edinburgh, and we work with all sorts of different companies to help them make the most of their data and to get really effective results by using their data. My background is software engineering. I focused on data science because I discovered how effective it is as actually helping businesses run effectively. And that crosses from the types of things you might do with your clients to more the operational stuff inside. I have a real fascination with data, and it's really data that I want to share some insights with you about today and how it ties into the world of digital transformation, because I think we've got a little bit of a problem going on in there. The thing about data to me is that it seems quite simple. We have digital tools that we use, we collect information doing our day-to-day tasks in those tools, and then we do something with that information. Now, what that might be as simple as reporting. How is the business doing? Are we getting the number of customers we want? Are we selling the number of widgets that we're doing effectively? Whatever that is, we can report back on our data. Now, to me, that sounds really straightforward, and yet, when I go in to work with an organisation, what I'm usually doing is unpicking a mess of data that is inside the digital systems. And that's why my question that I want to ponder today is, what does come first? Do we think about the data? Do we think about the digital? And how are they aligned? And I'm going to give you a few of my own personal opinions on how we can do that better along the way. I hope you have plenty of questions as we get to the end. You may have differences of opinions, which would be great to hear. But I do want you thinking about data, perhaps in a slightly different way from what you do at the moment. One of the problems that we find is that as going into an organisation, whether it's a small one, whether it's a startup, whether or not it's a larger one, is that often tools have been selected in quite an organic way. You have a particular need, you have a particular problem, and you look to solve it, which kind of makes sense. You go online, you do a little bit of Googling, and suddenly you have selected a tool. You've signed up, you've got a 30-day trial that you can give it a bit of a bash, and you go, yeah, it's okay. I'll give it a go. We'll see how we get on with it. The problem is we see that across all the areas of businesses. And so we see the finance team have done that, and maybe the HR team and the sales team, and so it goes on. And what we end up with is really disparate sets of data, and they're not joined in any way at all. And in fact, people might be very, very unaware of what's going on in some of those sets of data. You might not know that you have a piece of information in one of them that's also duplicated, at least in partial, in one of the other ones. And when we come in and we ask about what you're actually doing and how you're reporting and what you want to do, they can't get that information. It's all spread all over the place. And that's a real blocker to using data in a really innovative way. One of the reasons I think for that is about having the wrong people in the room when those decisions are being made. And so think about how people are making decisions about what you're using. Have you got someone that isn't just IT? IT are obviously a key part of any digital or data transformation, but they are not alone in making the decisions. So who's making a choice about what you're doing? Who's making a choice about the tools? Have you even got the data skills in-house? Have you got the right people, have the right knowledge to make a decision about what you need to do with data? That's often where we see the problem. And then the function in terms of what you're doing, maybe gathering the data. If you're sales, you know you need to have certain pieces of information recorded, but you focus on a day-to-day basis, what are you going to do? Not what we think of long-term, how are we going to use your data? What are we going to do with that data? What is the vision of the company? And we get bogged down in those types of activities, and then the wrong decisions are made about the tools, and then we can't do anything with the data at the end of it all. Trying to do too much too quickly is usually a big problem as well. We quite often have people that come to us and say, we want an AI solution. That's really nice, but actually that's probably not what you need in the really early stages of things. So we try to break it down a little bit into the chunks of what we're trying to achieve. The impact of not thinking about data at the early stages of doing a digital transformation is that you can really lose control on what's going on inside the business. What we often see is senior management reporting back that they don't know the answer to quite a fundamental question within the business. Or if they do know the answer, it's really out of date because they had to wait for a report to come back to them. Now, that's a real problem if you're not able to react quickly. You're not seeing maybe the impact of changes in the market, political changes, things that are happening in our economy. If you can't see the answer to that, then you're not going to be in control of what's going on in your data. And most of that leads into a big challenge that we find is about frustrated employees. They get asked to do tasks that they just can't do. The systems aren't set up for them in a way that they can do it effectively, or they have to extract bits of data from different tools in different places, and a bit's over here and a bit's over there, and they have to join it together in some way. And that's a real challenge for them. And in all honesty, that's usually where we hear a lot of complaints when we speak to the team about what they're trying to do is they don't know where the data is, they don't know how to bring it together, and they might not even know how to access it in the first place, which again comes back to IT. It's such a fundamental part of making this work. The overload that we see on IT teams because people who want to use the data can't use the data is huge. Suddenly, IT are supposed to know what's needed in reports. They have to do data dumps. They just have too much to do that really genuinely is their job. But if we're not doing the data part right, they get stuck doing these things as well. All of this leads up to data quality issues. And that is one of the biggest challenges we have when people come to us and do say things like, I want an AI solution. How are we going to use the data well if the data has duplicates, it has gaps, it has one version of the truth over here, but mysteriously a different version of the truth over here? If we don't bring them together and we don't think about the content of those systems and how they'll be used, it makes it really difficult for us as we move forward. And in my opinion, the thing that you need is that bigger picture vision. You need a data strategy. It's not just about digital, and it might not be a separate piece. You might bring it together so that you're actually doing one thing. But thinking about data as part of your strategic move forward is really, really important. We start when we're doing a data strategy thinking about what your business goals are. What are you actually trying to achieve? We don't focus on the tools, we don't focus on the technical, we focus on the business and what you're trying to achieve out of that. And we ask the questions about what you want to know. That's a really, really important part that's often lost. The question tends to be, what do you want the tool to do for you, not what are you going to do with the data that the tool collects at the end of everything. Data is quite often pushed right out to the end and not considered until after choices are made. We establish a baseline by asking lots and lots of questions of everyone. So the IT teams, the finance teams, anyone that's using any of the systems, we ask them what they want to do. What are you trying to achieve with your data? Now, that part is quite interesting because quite often what we discover is that people just don't have what they want. They see it as a therapy session has been described, a bit of a data therapy session, when we ask them, what do you want to know? How do you find that answer at the moment? And what are you not getting to do that's on your wish list and that you really wish you could do? It's a really important part of the process. And quite often, again, the focus is on the tool. What do you want to do on a day-to-day basis when you're using those tools? Not what will you do once you know the information that these tools are storing. When we start analysing all of this information, we get into looking at our opportunities and our risks. It's a really important part to start thinking about in the early stages. We don't want to get to the end of a full digital transformation, have lots of interesting new and useful tools come into place. But what you haven't thought about is that longer term vision. AI comes into play at this point. Thinking about an AI solution is much, much more than just deciding that you want to do it. We need to think about the types of data that you'll need. We need to think about the volumes of data that you might need. We need to think about data management approaches and the structure that you might have for things. All of those pieces are really, really important that you need to think about right in the early stages, rather than thinking about it once you have the tools in place. You may end up with missing pieces of data, and solutions like AI solutions take quite large volumes and potentially over quite a long period of time. It's really important that you think about that in the early stages, such that you don't get to the point that you think you can do it and go, wow, we're missing a piece of information. If we had recorded that piece of information, we might be able to do this, but actually we just didn't do it. Thinking about the potential is really, really important, but the risk is just as important. What we quite often identify is gaps. And gaps can be a real hindrance, whether we're thinking about an AI solution or actually thinking about aspects around what you're doing internally. How are you reporting on information? How are you sharing things with the rest of the company? How are you creating the right architecture such that you can access your data quickly? You can access your data securely. All of these things have real impact, particularly we do work with quite a lot of startups. What we see then is that we can have a real problem when we're doing things like investment. If you're going through some sort of due diligence, then if you don't have these things in place, you can really get a lot of pushback and you can really struggle to get some of that. So for startups in particular, it's really important for them to be thinking about the risk areas and starting to prioritise. And ultimately, what comes out of this process is a roadmap. We think about what we want to do, and we think about how to break it into manageable chunks. Data is quite a scary place for people. They're not quite sure about some of the words, the buzzwords. It's one of those areas, it's full of them. We really try to break it into chunks that you can do potentially yourself. We're really keen on kind of like quick wins, things that you within your company might be able to do, and you don't necessarily have to go out and get immediate external expertise to help you with. One of the key things that we ask throughout that process is, what do you want to know about your business? And this is maybe a key thing that I want you to think about when you're doing a digital piece of work. Have you asked the right people what they need to know about the business? And those questions are the ones that should drive what you want in your data. You don't want to ask them that once you've got it in place, because that's the point that you'll probably realise you might have missed something. So I've got a really simple example at the moment, which is thinking about KPIs. So KPIs come up all the time, and most people roll their eyes slightly. I definitely saw some eye rolling in the room just now. It feels like it's one of those management things. You really don't want to have to think about them most of the time. You feel quite cut off from them. They're not part of your day-to-day activities. And that's a real shame. If you step back and think of them just as a metric, actually they bring lots of opportunity, and you should be able to understand where your KPIs are at any point. If you are senior management, or if you go back and ask any of your senior management, do they know the current state of play of the KPIs for your business? I'd be surprised if most of them could tell you where it is today. They might be able to tell you where it was a month ago when they got handed a report. Or if you're lucky, you might have a dashboard of some sort. But the reality is, what we see is reports that come out with really lots of writing, static views of data in a graph that someone's created. We quite often find that people don't read those reports, not as much as they should, or they don't pay attention to the detail of them. And we push back quite often and ask why you've got somebody that spends their entire life writing reports. Your data is not being effective for you if that's what's happening. Someone's spending days of their time putting together reports and creating a visual that you are leaving open to interpretation. Do you know that the person reading that report is actually looking at it and saying the same thing as you are when you're putting it together? That can be really frustrating, and quite often KPIs aren't thought about until the ends of the process again. So I would like you to think about changing that and thinking about it at the beginning. Now, this is a really quick mock-up that I did with a client we were working with when we started talking about KPIs. This was before we did a piece of data strategy work. We just asked them, what KPIs have you got at the moment? And they had a quite straightforward one. How many new customers have you had in a period of time? And currently, they got that by a report that somebody spent a few days pulling together, pulling all the data out of all those disparate systems. And they got a report that said 37 new customers. Yes. Is that good? Is it bad? That's all they got told. Now, from the point of view that you're doing what you're doing with your data, you are completely wasting an opportunity with that. And that's what this little mock-up that we did with them was, to get them to start thinking about that data in a different way. But this starts to have impact on how you might collect, store, and use your data, which is why you want to do this at the beginning, not at the end. So in this particular case, we gave them the little example of what about looking at some historic data? What about this time a year ago? Or even just the week before we were actually looking at these numbers? What about your target that you sat in a senior management team and said, that's what we're going to do. We think we can do this based on whatever you talked about. How do you know what that was? Does anyone remember? It's maybe in an email somewhere. It's maybe tucked away in a set of minutes that somebody took in the meeting. This is about exposing your data, because a lot of times data is trapped inside those systems. It's got minimal reports that are done with it, and those reports often head upwards. They go up through the management ranks. People that are actually creating that data, that are making the sales, that are doing something very proactive with that information, are not seeing that data. So think about how you can change that, and you can actually expose some of that data so that suddenly your KPIs become a live and active figure that you can work with. Now, the reason I highlight this is it impacts what you do in terms of your planning. In this particular case, you're thinking about things like, I want to be able to see the data from a year ago. Have you designed your system such that that's what's going to happen? Can you get that information when you need it? Quite often, you'll find that the answer is no. It's either gone altogether because it's not stuff you needed to keep. It's possibly been aggregated up in some way so that you've got some version of that data, but not quite what you wanted. By doing this right at the very beginning, you start to really put a bit of enthusiasm into your senior management team about how data could help them understand if that number is good, bad, where they're going, what's the view that you might have within a period of time, let alone getting into the world of AI, which we're not going to cover at all at the moment. So the problem is that that is all doable, and yet when we go into companies, it's just not happening. And the reasons why it's not happening is primarily about senior management buy-in. That's a huge problem that we see. The lack of awareness by senior management to be able to understand how it can bring value is really, really important. So if you do have a data project that you're thinking about, and you're thinking about how you can get the resource you need, perhaps the costs that you need to do something with it, getting engagement of your senior management team is really, really key. There's all sorts of things you can do there. I'm not going to have time today to go into a lot of them. I can catch up with anyone after if you want to talk about some of that. But engaging with your senior management team is really, really key. Change always has those who've always done it in a particular way. And data, I think, is a slightly interesting one. Data is a scary word to a lot of people, and they actually do see it as something that potentially has impact on them and their role, and they worry that what it means is that their role might go and that it's not going to be needed anymore, because AI is the classic word, I think, that really terrifies people. They think their role is going to be replaced in some way by AI. We always try to encourage a really positive spin on that, which is not about replacing people, but it is about replacing some of the mundane tasks that they have to do, thinking about automation, thinking about how they can have that happen behind the scenes, but actually they can focus on their skill set so they can analyse the data. They can look at what's happening inside their business and make key decisions based off that. IT come up again. Poor old IT. I have mentioned them quite a lot, but IT are supposed to be miracle workers. They're supposed to just make things work. And so, well, if there's a problem with the data at the end of it all, it's fine. IT will sort it. It's not IT's responsibility to make decisions about what's in the data, how will we use the data, and how will that help us move the business forward. They're there to provide the infrastructure, provide the support, but they're not there to be miracle workers. And a lack of skills. That is an absolutely key thing. We see that across all the different types of roles in businesses. Now, not everyone needs to be a data scientist. That's not what this is about. But people have to have a certain level of data literacy. They need to understand, if they're the ones creating the data, what impact them not doing it well might have. If there's poor data quality, go all the way back to the root cause. That's the way to solve it. But if it's people who don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, then they're not going to be that fussed about it, and they might just keep doing what they're doing. So think about how you increase the skills and use your biggest strength. Your team are your best asset you've got. They're hugely knowledgeable about whatever your business is, whatever it is. Don't discard them because of the fact that you see data as a complex and a separate thing. Do not rush into recruiting a data scientist. That is not going to solve your problem if you don't have a plan and a bit of structure in place to make that work successfully. I have added a little note. You might want one eventually, but you probably don't want one start out in the very first place. Use your team and use their expertise, use their enthusiasm about what they're doing, and look for opportunities to give them the chance to upskill. It's a really cost-effective way of starting working with data. Don't start recruiting immediately. Look for the people that are interested, look for the people that have got the right mindset, that analytical set of questions. When you do ask them, what do you want to know? Ask them, what can't they tell from their data? What do they want? What is their wish list of things? And give them responsibility. Give them responsibility for the data so that somebody cares about your data, because that's one of the biggest challenges we find when we ask who's responsible for this data set that is full of mistakes, errors, duplicates. Very, very rare that somebody is defined as the owner. Once we get up into the larger companies, it's a little bit more structured, but even there we do see the same thing. Use your team, make them the strength for you. And a bit of a whistle-stop tour through data strategies and data here. So I'm just going to leave you at this point with a few questions that I think you should ask before you make any decisions about a digital tool and what you're doing and any transformation project. What does your team actually need to do? How are you going to gather the data so that you can answer their questions that they're going to need? Think about it at the beginning. And ultimately, who's going to make those decisions about a strategic approach for your data rather than just digital? And I'll leave you at that note with a few of my contact details. We've got a little bit of time for some questions, and we have a microphone at the back of the room. Does anyone have any questions? I appreciate a very whistle-stop tour through those things. Any thoughts? No, photograph opportunity, clearly.
I do have a question. You mentioned at the beginning about a team asking for an AI solution. Do you feel that organisations, teams get caught up in a bit of hype and hyperbole about the latest buzzwords? You know, they see shiny new toys and they think, you know, let's get that. We have to have that. It's going to streamline and optimise every aspect of our business. But then when push comes to shove, it really has no impact because there's no quality underlying there.
Absolutely. I mean, we get that question all the time about AI, and I think when we step back and we start breaking it down into the steps that they need to take, they do realise that they are missing key pieces of information. The whole data management process, which we've really not touched on today, is so important to be able to achieve accurate and informative AI. And I think there's been enough problems, and a lot highlighted in press and things, the problems that you can have with AI if you implement it with inaccurate data, so the data quality thing comes in there. You have a big risk to your business if you don't put really strong foundations in place with your data. And so having aspirations as to that AI solution is brilliant. And being able to think about how you might come up with perhaps sort of predictive solutions for what you're doing to help make better decisions within the organisation is really, really important. But if you don't put those strong foundations in place, you're literally bodging things together. And that's quite often how we see tools being used. The concept of why a tool has been chosen within an organisation is really, really good. And the tool itself might actually be good, but it's perhaps not being configured in a way that's really helping the team that need to make use of the data, or the process behind how the teams will work with it has not been very effective. And so you really need to put those foundations in place to make sure that works really well. There's a question here.
Hey, thanks for that. My question is around managing expectations, because, as you mentioned, often the kind of infrastructure in terms of maybe skills or the tools that have been chosen aren't actually or process aren't even set up to kind of record the data that you would need to, say, produce the historical data like you gave in your example. So when you offer, let's say, a kind of some value from data or dashboard or whatever it is to a client, that sort of stuff needs to be set up first, and that'll probably take quite a bit of time before you can maybe get to that end result. So do you sort of set people up and then say, we'll come back to you in 6 months, or how do you manage that? Because it sounds like quite challenging.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and particularly with startups who really may have none of the data at that point. That could be an even bigger challenge. They haven't even got a version of the data in anything else. Depending what we're doing, we might take a whole different approach. We might actually look at synthetic data. So instead of just leaving a gap, part of the process that we might go through to help us do the next part really quite quickly is we'd start looking at synthesizing data. If we have structured and if we have configured the tools correctly, we know what we're going to get. So why wait? Why not start creating synthetic data that will allow us to start understanding quite quickly if we've made a mistake? We're not perfect. How can we try to establish what we have missed? Maybe there's a field of data that we've realised, I think that could be the solution. Something's not quite fitting correctly. Could we think about a broader set of data? Or we might realise that there's some external data that would come in. We've had projects that we've worked on which we ended up bringing weather data into, because that wasn't in the initial plans. But when we realised that it was to do with events and things like that, when we realised that there was the potential to use external data and we thought it might make a difference, we could make judgment calls on the numbers of people that were attending events. Amazing how the weather impacts who turns up at conferences and things. We brought the data in. So we kept going, even though the original data source was still getting added to as the new tool started to collect it. But there's things you can do to fill that gap rather than just saying, we'll be back.
So you can model historically backwards as well as,
yeah.
Often we're always doing it forwards, but you can do, that's a great answer. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another question now.
Hi there, Jeff Ballinger, Head of Data at Goodloop. Going back to what you said towards the start, I think, is it safe to say that the very first thing you've got to do before you start thinking about, the questions you need to answer, strategy, and then finally tools, is in most organizations, you're not doing a clean start, so it's really what data you currently have and where it's hiding. And maybe talk a bit about just how you approach that when you're going into one of these organizations who don't know where everything is.
And it's so surprising. I mean, when you say it out loud, it's like, surely everybody knows where the data is. Absolutely just not the case at all. Occasionally, I do say the words like, do you have a data dictionary? And there's much mirth in the room as it's like, no. Do you have any kind of plan? Or do you have any information, a data map, for example? It's incredibly rare, particularly in the smaller businesses, that they've done any of that stuff. It comes back to some of that organic growth, is people have done things quite independently, and there's been no responsible body to manage that and just to keep track of it. So that's part of what we do when we do a lot of interviews. We try to get a really good selection of people right across the company and understand what their roles are and what they're doing with their data. Inevitably, there's something that will come up during a session that will be, we used to have that thing. I think maybe such and such in another department knows it. And we tend to quite often get directed around. So that's what we start trying to do. We try to build up a data map of what people have. And we try to share that. I really, really think this about data is very hidden. We do not talk enough about the data. It's one of those behind the scenes. We talk about the tool, but we don't talk about the data behind the scenes. And so people don't realise what information might be captured in those. So that's where we start. We try to create a data map. We try to create data dictionaries, really high level ones, and we share them with all the people we're talking with. And the surprise that sometimes comes from people going, I didn't know they had that piece of information. I could have used that for the thing that I was doing before. And to try and put clarity and structure on it. Obviously, the ideal scenario is you start that at the very beginning, but the reality is, most people don't do that. But that's how I would approach it, is start speaking to the key people that are doing some of the day-to-day tasks, not just the management team. That's maybe where a big flaw is. Don't just talk to management. Any final questions? No, thank you very much. I hope you've got a few takeaways and enjoy the rest of your day.